What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. We have an exciting episode for you today. Joined with me is Dr. Matthew Nagra. Dr. Nagra, how's it going?
It's going great over here. Sunny in Vancouver today.
Unfortunately, that is not the case in Philadelphia. We just got
I
hit
know.
with a thunderstorm.
Oh, wow.
Hopefully, everything holds up with the internet connection throughout our chat today. We have a lot of truly fascinating topics to uncover here. But for the listeners who might not already be familiar with you and your work, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm based in Vancouver, as I just mentioned. I'm a naturopathic doctor out here who focuses primarily on nutrition, dealing with chronic disease prevention or treatment, in addition to obviously conventional therapies. If a patient comes in, they're wanting to get off their statins, I'm usually the one convincing them that no, that's probably not the best idea. You need to be keeping on with that. So I do a little bit of everything there, and then I spend a lot of time online. Instagram seems to be where I'm most active, but I also have been getting occasionally more active on Twitter as well, just talking about a lot of these different nutrition topics and writing articles for My Nutrition Science. I helped out Plant Proof, for those of you who are aware of Simon Hill's podcast and blog, with his recent book called The Proof is in the Plant. So I'm credited in there as well. So just got my hands in all these different areas, just helping out where I can.
Fantastic. As you mentioned there, you're a strong advocate of plant-based nutrition. And I would say that any evidence-based practitioner within this nutrition space should be supportive of plant-based nutrition, a diet that is primarily comprised of plants. But then, of course, we can take this a further step, right? And then we have vegan diets, which are exclusively plants. And maybe, a step down from that, we have different forms of vegetarian diets. But ultimately, vegan diets, especially in the social media nutrition space, can be a controversial topic. And there are strong supporters of this. And as we know, when we start to edge towards treating our diet similar to a religion, we start to become a little biased in our viewpoints. And we want the studies to say the exact thing that we want it to say. So for those reasons, and considering your role in social media and putting out truly evidence-based nutrition content, I want to hear from you some problems that you think are going on in the plant-based community. So when it comes to popular claims made by proponents of vegan diets, which ones have you found that seem to be constantly repeated, but don't exactly line up with the most current evidence on the topic?
Yeah, actually, before we get to that, I'll just note that I do, as much as I tackle, the keto crowd and everything, I will sort of debunk common vegan myths as well, because, I do want us to be as accurate as possible. I think that's the best way to, promote our cause, ultimately, for those of us who are, ethically driven and environmentally driven. So I actually made a post myself about things I have been wrong about in the nutrition space. And I just thought, I'll normalize it. I want to try to normalize the idea that you can change your view when presented with new info, or when you become, aware of things that maybe were false in the past. And it ended up blowing up into one of my most popular posts. And I thought it was hilarious how everyone was like so pumped on me talking about all these things I was wrong about. But at the same time, I think it was good for starting conversations, because a lot of people commented on it saying that, oh, why isn't that correct? Or I thought this doctor says that this is the case. And so a couple of them, and there are more that we can get into, but a couple of the big ones are this idea that higher fat diets, whether, including certain oils or heavier on nuts and seeds, are detrimental to cardiovascular health. And then there's the other claim about heart disease reversal, that I don't believe has been shown as of yet. So just starting with like the high fat and oil kind of, that kind of crew, or that kind of thought or viewpoint, it really stems from these studies, or this one study in particular that's always cited, where they took, or they measured what's called flow mediated dilation. So they measured the ability of blood vessels to dilate after consuming these, and it wasn't even just oils. They had specific types of oils and other foods and things that they were consuming at the same time. So that aside, they found that rush of fat into the bloodstream was somehow able to impair the ability of the blood vessels to dilate. Now, they take that to mean that, oh, it's detrimental for cardiovascular health, it's going to lead to higher risk of cardiovascular disease. However, while that has been shown to associate with cardiovascular disease, the endothelial dysfunction, the inability to dilate properly, that has not been shown if it's only after meals. So we're talking like if you're in a fasted state, you haven't eaten anything, and you're already having issues with vasodilation, that can be a problem. But if you're just having that temporary, even though it lasts hours, but that temporary endothelial dysfunction after meals, it's actually not going to, as far as we know, or has not been shown to contribute to cardiovascular disease. But that's not even the only problem here. We literally have data on these different foods. We have data on nuts and seeds. And when we look at meta-analyses on nut consumption and cardiovascular disease or all-cause mortality, so death from all causes, it is one of the best foods for reducing your risk of those. So if we're talking about nuts, I have no idea how anyone can argue for a limiting nuts in one's diet. That one just makes no sense. Now on the oils, there is some nuance, but if we look at olive oil, for example, very consistently beneficial. Actually, a very recent meta-analysis on various oils, and this included seed oils like canola oil, for example, again, showed reduction in risk. And that's the one that is always claimed to be problematic. And they actually found that replacing butter with things like canola oil would actually be better, or lower your risk further. So again, it's just there are reasons to, or the reasons that these people often think that these foods are harmful are based on these individual kind of mechanisms, right? You see these different mechanisms that can occur in the body, or you have theories behind oxidation of the fats in certain oils or whatever, but they aren't looking at what actually happens to your disease risk, or what actually happens to your risk of premature death if you take people who are well matched for all these other variables as far as diet and lifestyle goes, and are just varying in their levels of consumptions of these different oils. And if you look at that and you match them up, then those consuming more of the oils seem to be doing better. So I don't think you need to consume those oils, but I certainly don't think there's any harm. And I think definitely when replacing things like butter or high saturated fat oils like coconut oil or palm oil, you're definitely doing yourself a good thing there. You're definitely doing better by switching over to the seed oils or the olive oil.
Frequent listeners of the podcast will be familiar with how I like to bring up that nutrition Twitter is a special place.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things going on there that prior to being exposed to it, just looking at my education as a dietitian, when I stumbled across these debates, I was like, what's going on here? Like, this is outrageous. We recently had on Nick Hebert, the Nutrivore, and we went into a whole thing about seed oils. And as you mentioned here, there's this fascination with how certain fats might be oxidized and how that can contribute to disease risk. Then we have all of this longitudinal data in humans showing robust positive health outcomes from tissue levels of linoleic acid. And it's just really interesting. And I think I missed the whole olive oil debate on Twitter, but you kind of alluded to it there. And that's another thing where I'm like, are we really arguing over this?
Yeah, and that's the funniest one, because even like the study that is always cited for that, they didn't even use like an extra virgin olive oil or anything. They used like this refined olive oil that, again, yes, it led to some postprandial endothelial dysfunction. Doesn't matter if it did. But and then, people extrapolate from that saying you should limit extra virgin olive oil too. And it's just, there's no, I don't know how they get from A to B there.
I think a lot of people, like to focus on the differences between diets, right? And when it comes to specific camps of dietary preferences, it's like, oh, well, your diet isn't as good as my diet. My diet's the best. And in particular, we could look at vegans versus people who follow a ketogenic diet that's kind of centered around animal proteins. And I guess we kind of stumbled on a similarity here. They both have a hate for seed oils, which doesn't seem to be supported by the evidence.
And to be clear, I know you're talking about like vegan myths. It's not even a myth to do with a vegan diet. Like, you can eat a vegan diet and eat oils, right? That's fine. It's just a very common myth within the vegan space that further has people limiting their diets beyond what they need to, and leads to those sorts of issues as well.
Excellent. Now I want to transition to a similarly general question, just focusing on perhaps a more positive light when it comes to all of these potential criticisms of a vegan diet. And prior to this, we were working on an outline together, and there's a wide variety that we could dive into
Yeah.
here. But when it comes to most recent claims, maybe based on new studies that have come out, what claims against vegan diets have you noticed that also aren't supported by the current evidence?
One of the most common ones, or one of the most recent ones, I should say, is this idea that vegan children are at risk of being stunted or they don't grow as much. And this came out of a study in Poland from, it was earlier this year, I believe. And basically, what they did is they looked at kids aged 5 to 10. They had vegetarians, vegans, and omnivores who were relatively well matched for lifestyle and socioeconomics and all that. And they found that at the end of the day, and we can get into the other findings as well, but they found that the vegans were a little bit shorter. They had a lower Z score. It wasn't super low, but they were at minus 0.57, which means about half a standard deviation below the average. And we should note that while headlines might say that vegans are at risk of stunted growth, stunting is described or defined as 2 standard deviations below average. So they certainly were not anywhere even near that. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that they were on the lower end and were somewhat concerned about them. Well, there was another issue with this study. As I alluded to, they looked at a variety of different outcomes. So they looked at their cardiovascular risk factors. They looked at different types of measurements for height, different types of measurements for BMI, body fat, and so on. And when you're doing this, there's a higher chance of like a false positive. Or just if you're looking at a whole bunch of things, one of them is going to show up, right? It's just kind of common sense in that view. So what they should have done was they should have done an adjustment. I don't know where that word came from. Adjustment for multiple comparisons. And when you do that, you actually find that the values did not reach statistical significance for height specifically. So even though they tended to be a little bit on the lower end, or they trended in that direction of being a little bit on the lower end, it wasn't statistically significant. It could be due to chance, and it wasn't anywhere near risk of stunting to begin with. At the same time, 29% of the vegan kids didn't even supplement B12 or eat fortified foods. That is tragic. They need to be supplementing. That is something that we all know very, very well. There was also a lower vitamin D status in the non-supplementing vegans, which isn't a surprise, which was about 1/3 of them. But on the other hand, 13% of the omnivore children had high LDL. And these are kids 5 to 10, right? That's not good. That is going to set them up for a very high risk of cardiovascular disease later on if they don't fix that. Whereas only 0% of the vegans had high LDL, and only 1% was like borderline high. So on both sides, we have the vegans who aren't properly supplementing, aren't really doing the diet properly, so to speak. And then we have the omnivores who clearly aren't doing their diet properly either. We can fix both of these issues, right? We can have the omnivores consuming lower saturated fat diets, even if they are including animal products. We can have the vegans properly supplementing, making sure they're eating enough overall. And we actually have data on that as well. We have German studies that came out, a couple of them in the last year, one looking at ages 1 to 3, another one looking at ages 6 to 18. We have a study from Finland. We have another one, I believe. Oh, and then we have like older studies from back in like the 80s and so on. And all of these studies were looking at vegans and omnivores and comparing vegans who actually knew what they were doing, were supplementing appropriately. Actually, one of the studies had them, the Finnish study in particular, had nutritionists or dietitians working with the kids in a daycare setting, so just making sure that they are supplementing appropriately and everything. And when we look at all of those groups, they have proper growth, they have great biomarkers, their cardiovascular risk factors are usually very good, which is something we want to start young if possible. So I think these headlines are being blown way out of proportion. I do think the statistical analysis, like I said, there were some issues there as well. But these are all things that can be taken care of if you just know what you're doing.
If memory serves, for the recent Polish study, literally at the end of the statistical analysis, they were like, yeah, we didn't adjust for multiple comparisons because this is an exploratory study.
Yeah.
Like, so right there, I mean, even like, if they pre-specified these
Yeah.
outcomes and everything else, like when something is considered exploratory, we're not going to take that at face value and say like, oh, this is obviously the answer, right? Just like, if there was a better conducted trial and they pre-specified outcomes and they adjust for multiple comparisons, like at the end of the day, if you have 15 secondary outcomes, like we shouldn't take all those
Yeah.
values and just say this is it, like these are all
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah, it's basically like p hacking. And
Yeah.
and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's sometimes you'll see this in studies. Usually this is more of a shady tactic, and I'm not saying that they meant to do that here, but if someone wanted to look at research on a specific type of food, maybe they work in an industry related to it and they wanted to find some benefit, they would look for just a bunch of different outcomes, like a whole bunch of different measurements. Whatever one shows up statistically significant, they'd pick that and say, look, it improves X outcome. And that's kind of what happened in this case. Although I don't necessarily think it was intentional. It was exploratory, as you mentioned, but certainly those running with the headlines should not have been doing so.
Yeah, and as you very well outlined, there is the need to look past the abstract, past the headline. There are a lot of issues with this, and then of course, when we look at the overall body of evidence, we tend to see that when vegans, dot their I's and cross their
Yeah.
T's, we don't run into any issues, and the same seems to be the case for the risk of fractures, right? That's
Yeah.
another thing that's commonly brought up. When it comes to athletes, like the first thing that comes to mind is when I think Cam Newton, the quarterback in the NFL, switched to a vegan diet at one point. Then he up breaking something. Everyone's like, oh,
Yeah.
vegan diets, right? Like this is just what happens. And it's just like, and then we could even talk about other celebrities, right? I feel like I see a headline like every couple of months and it's like, oh, this popular actress started like losing her hair on a vegan diet or
Yeah.
whatever. And came out. And it's just like, these people weren't doing it correctly.
Yeah. And as a personal note, actually, speaking of the Cam Newton story, when I before I went vegan, I actually gave up dairy first. That was when I was like 15 or so. I quit consuming dairy. All my friends knew I was doing that, and then a week later, I broke my leg. And I got all the like, oh, see, it's because you stopped having milk and all of that. It's like that's not how fast your bone mineral density changes, but okay.
Oh, I love it. That's too funny. But before we leave this general topic, I think it's only right to touch on soy, just because this
Yep.
is a particularly strong myth that doesn't want to die. So, how about you touch on the effects of dietary soy intake in relation to hormones and just overall health?
Yeah, so it's important to touch on like where the concerns come from, right? So there are some studies where you isolate the phytoestrogens from soy. They're typically called isoflavones. There are various types of them, but we'll just use either phytoestrogen or isoflavones for this combo. And so they'll isolate those. They'll put them in some sort of a concentrated form, and they'll feed them to rodents. And when you feed these high concentrations to rodents, they run into problems. So there can be like cancer growth, there can be all sorts of things. They just don't do well on it. Now, some will look at that and say, oh, well, soy is terrible for you, but you shouldn't be consuming it that way. And there's a couple issues. One, we aren't rodents. Two, we don't really consume them in that way. I mean, there are isoflavone supplements. Even then, they aren't at that concentration. And it's typically not recommended to do those, at least until we have more data. Now, there are a couple human cases that also get brought up. So there are some cases of men, there's a couple that I can think of off the top of my head, where they were consuming basically soy only diets. So we're talking, up to like 20 servings a day, depending on the study you look at. On the lower end, we're still like in the teens. And they may have run into issues. So one of them, I believe it was a libido or erectile function issue. The other one had some gynecomastia that resolved when they quit consuming the soy. So we can't say for sure that the soy foods were contributing to those issues just because it's a one-off case study. But even if we grant that, even if we say, yes, it was the soy that caused that, these were just ridiculous amounts of soy, right? Nobody's recommend. I wouldn't. Now, I'm not concerned about consuming too much soy, but at the same time, I want you to eat more than one type of food. I want you to vary your diet. I want you having the whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, different types of legumes, nuts and seeds. I want all of that in your diet. So we shouldn't put too much stock in that. Now, we actually have a meta-analysis on randomized controlled trials that was just recently updated, came out in December, looking at male hormone levels with varying levels of the isoflavone or soy consumption. And there was no change in any kind of hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and so on. The funny thing is, if you look at, they did a subgroup analysis for just the studies that used higher doses of isoflavones. And if anything, it actually trended towards higher testosterone levels. So obviously not making a firm claim there because it wasn't significant, but it just goes to show that certainly these claims around reducing testosterone aren't really of concern. We also have data on females in a similar story. As far as the primary hormones like the estrogen, progesterone, and so on, there's no changes there. There are slight differences in either FSH or LH, I can't recall, but didn't end up impacting the estrogen levels or progesterone levels. So not really a concern there. And then what ultimately matters, as I've talked about before, are health outcomes. And we have data on health outcomes. The one thing I study, or the one study I cite most often is the umbrella review that was published a little bit over a year ago now, maybe a year and a half ago, looking at 43 different health outcomes. They included roughly around 115 different meta-analyses. So this was just a massive amount of data. And if you go down the list, soy actually reduced risk of things like breast cancer, endometrial cancer, colorectal cancer, stomach cancer, ovarian cancer, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. It was just like on and on and on. In fact, the only risk that was seen was increased risk in stomach cancer, specifically with miso soup consumption. And that seemed specific to those consuming a lot of miso soup on a daily basis, which is very high in sodium. And we do have reason to believe that sodium increases stomach cancer risk. So it wasn't even the soy in that case. So I see no reason to be trying to avoid soy at normal human levels of consumption, not like the full soy diet as I was talking about. And if anything, I think it should be encouraged just because of all the benefits that they can come along with.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more. Just another note on rodent studies, to the points you mentioned, is that we have to realize also that in these rodent studies, we're typically trying to elicit an effect, right? So like it's a similar story for artificial sweeteners, and we run away with these findings, and it's like we are literally trying to give enough artificial sweeteners to this rat to get this certain effect. And it's like you could drink 40 cans of Diet Coke and try to replicate that, but like we don't need to do that. We could also just keep giving you water until we elicit hyponatremia, and you're or like try to drown you through water consumption. Like these are completely separate contexts. You can't just take these findings and be like, well, clearly it's negative all the time in any dose.
Exactly. And the dose is what makes it. I mean, we'll get to things like red meat and everything. It always seems to just come back to the dose. And some things are detrimental at lower doses. Some things it takes a whole lot. And soy is one of those things where if it's detrimental, it's going to take a whole lot to get there.
Definitely. So yeah, let's transition to animal foods, plant foods, the relationship with cardiometabolic disease. And ultimately, this is a game of compared to what, right? So whenever we're looking at these dietary interventions or reviews on, does red meat do this? Does milk do that? We need to consider the dose of these foods. And then we also need to consider what might be substituted out of the diet for increases in these foods. So I think I want to start with red meat. That's probably the most controversial food within the space. I don't know. Maybe eggs is right up there with it. I'm not too sure. But we had a pretty interesting crossover trial on red meat recently, and they were looking at the effect of red meat in varying quantities in the context of a Mediterranean diet, which tends to be pretty darn healthy. And on the surface, if you just look at the abstract, it's, hey, big win for red meat, everyone. If all other aspects of your diet are healthy, perhaps you're consuming Mediterranean diet, then don't worry about
Yeah.
consuming, a moderate quantity of red meat every day. But when you dig a little bit deeper, there's probably some more nuances that we have to consider. So why don't you kind of outline some of the things that we should be considering in the study outside of just, oh, here are the main findings, and then take it
Yeah.
and run away with it?
Yeah, so they were comparing a Mediterranean diet with lean red meat. So that's very important to note, lean red meat, which is not what most people eat, right? Most people probably eat around 80% lean, so 20% fat. And then they looked at varying quantities. So half a serving versus 2.5 servings versus I think it was 5.5 servings was the upper end. And they were comparing it to the average American diet. So they had another diet that was designed to meet, the average American sort of dietary pattern. And they found that compared to the average American diet, the Mediterranean plus red meat diets, all three of them at varying levels of intake, reduced cardiovascular risk factors like LDL, for example. Now, what a lot of the conclusions that have been drawn from this is that, red meat's fine, doesn't matter how much you eat, or I should say lean red meat's fine, doesn't matter how much you eat. If you're eating a Mediterranean diet, it's not going to affect your risk. Well, I don't think that tells the whole story, because if you look at for starters, the saturated fat intakes in all the Mediterranean diets was under 10%. That's good news. That's what we want to aim for. The average American diet was over 10%, which is not what we want. So we know that if you reduce saturated fat intake, your LDL is going to go down for the most part, unless you really manipulate other variables as well. So that's one thing. But if you look at the trend in both LDL and ApoB, which I know you spoke about that with Gil, who was on here not long ago. So if people need more info on that, please go listen to that episode. But if you look at just the LDL changes, there is a stepwise drop when you go from the 5.5 down to the 0.5 servings. Stepwise drop in LDL, it just was not statistically significant between groups, but it was close. And so that suggests that maybe the study was just underpowered to detect those differences in between, but we definitely see a clear trend there. At the same time, we actually have a recent meta-analysis looking at red meat interventions and swapping it out for various foods. And again, that comes back to compared to what. And when they look specifically at the lean red meat interventions or the lean meat interventions, they found that when they're comparing to a diet higher in saturated fat, the LDL dropped. When they're comparing to a diet lower in saturated fat or same with saturated fat, it did not. That's totally expected, right? That's no surprise there. But when they compared lean red meat to plants, the plants still did better. So just because the study found that the lean red meat wasn't all that detrimental based on just those markers of LDL ApoB compared to average American diet doesn't mean you can't still do better. And this is something that I've gotten into a lot with a lot of people online around this idea of, is lean red meat super healthy, safe, you can just go nuts with it. And one really interesting study too to note is that there was a crossover trial done where they compared red meat versus white meat versus non-meat or plant protein. This was a crossover trial, and they also split up into two groups of high saturated fat and low saturated fat. So you had 6 different sort of dietary patterns you're looking at. No surprises, high saturated fat led to higher LDL, low saturated fat, lower LDL. But then between groups, only the non-meat group, so the plant protein group, actually reduced or had lower LDL compared to both the red meat and white meat, with no difference between red and white meat. So again, that shows that swapping it out, even when matched for things like fiber and saturated fat and polyunsaturated fats, and like they had the diets pretty well identical except the source of protein, and there were differences in cholesterol between groups. So let's not rule out the impact that might have on LDL as well. So from what I've said so far, basically depends what you're comparing to. And compared to plants, red meat, even if matched for saturated fat or low in saturated fat, still seems to be less ideal. Well, we have what are called substitution analyses that have come out now. And these are looking at over long-term follow-ups with plenty of participants, what actually happens to disease risk when you sub out a certain protein source for another protein source. But they go further and look at with equal saturated fat or polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat, carbohydrates, fiber, and so on. So that, again, they're matching the diets and matching the lifestyles and just looking at those swaps. And we do find that when you swap red meat protein for plant protein based on one recent sub-analysis, this one was by Huang, I believe from last year, they found that swapping red meat for plant meat, just 3% of calories, lowered risk of all-cause mortality by 13%. So that's pretty substantial in men and 15% in women. We look at cardiovascular disease, it's 12% in men, 18% in women. So these are very small swaps that we're looking at, matched for saturated fat, matched for all these other dietary variables, and still leading to a benefit if choosing plants. And one of the reasons I think that is the case, and one of the reasons I think these substitution analyses are so great, is because they look at what's inherent to the food. So when you're eating red meat, even if we don't care about the saturated fat for a second, you're still going to get all these other compounds with it. You're still going to get the dietary cholesterol. You're still going to get the heme iron. You're still going to get all these other compounds that may or may not exert negative effects. And this is ultimately the way to really see, does it lead to a negative effect beyond what we already know? So I would be very hesitant to jump on board with the whole lean red meat is fine and go nuts kind of mentality, because I do think there's still risk there, but I don't really see much of a risk if you're having like, 1 or 2 servings a week. There's going to be a threshold. If we look at Seventh-day Adventist population, comparing basically no red meat to small amounts, the risk seems to go up around like 2.5, 3 servings a week, if I recall correctly. So I would keep it under that if I was to eat meat.
Phenomenal. And like you touched on there, in moderation, have at it, like most things in the context of an overwhelmingly healthy diet is perfectly fine. But I guess this is a discussion that we have to have with things nowadays like the carnivore diet,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I
And
know.
even if you're not following a carnivore diet, just if you're exposed to that community, you might say, well, if these people all they do is eat, steak and fatty lamb, whatever, then I could at least have a couple portions a day and eat it with some other stuff, and there'd be no risk because look,
Yeah.
this guy improved this, that, and the other thing, and all he eats is steak, so it should be fine for me with other foods in my diet, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the real danger there is, and I've had patients who've come in saying they're, well, my husband wants to try the, either a carnivore or keto diet or whatever. They heard it was good for X, Y, and Z, issue, and I have to basically talk them off the ledge because I have to explain like, that's not the best way to go, and this is why.
Yeah, you highlighted a few controlled trials there on lean red meat, and these were very well conducted. I wasn't familiar with 1 or 2 of them that you linked, and I was reading them over for a chat,
Yeah.
and they were great. I believe in the one that was the crossover with the plant protein, the white meat,
Yep.
and the red meat. Wasn't all food provided for each of the study phases, I think?
I believe it was. Yeah, I believe they wanted to really tightly control what was being eaten, and that's why they matched up all. That's how they matched up all those other variables, right? You wouldn't be able to do it a free living or eating whatever you want.
And then we saw these, they weren't just statistically significant. These were clinically meaningful
Yeah,
differences. And these were over what, 2 weeks on each diet, right?
yeah, yeah. And here's the, oh no, 4 weeks each
Four
diet,
weeks.
2 to 7 week washout. But the funny thing is, the conclusions that I saw being drawn from it were red meat is no worse than white meat. That was the conclusion I heard being drawn a lot, rather than, oh, by the way, plant protein did better. And so yeah, it's just it's amazing how this stuff can get spun all the time.
Absolutely. So this brings us to observational research on red meat. And, people have their qualms with observational research, but in many cases, I like to think of it as where there's smoke, there's usually fire,
Yeah.
right? So I think everyone is well aware that the evidence for red meat intake and cardiometabolic disease, even colorectal cancer, right? It's pretty strong and it's consistent across
Mhm.
different populations. Yet, regardless of how many variables are controlled for, everyone just likes to throw out, well, it's observational evidence, it can't establish causation. Healthy user bias. These people were doing all of the wrong things. Like, yeah, they ate a lot of red meat, but they were also definitely obese, smoking, drinking alcohol, and sedentary. I didn't read any of the study, but I'm just telling you that's probably how it
Yeah,
went,
yeah, yeah.
which definitely isn't the case. But I would like for you to kind of expand on observational nutrition research for the listener, and kind of allow them to practically understand why, more or less, this is kind of the backbone of nutrition science.
Mhm.
And that's not exactly a bad thing.
Yeah, it's because I don't know how else we're going to follow people eating specific dietary patterns for a period of 15 or 20 years. What are you going to randomize them and see what happens? I mean, again, a recent guest here is Gil, Nutrition Made Simple. He was on. He was talking about in a recent video of his that he did on the whole stunted growth in kids topic, where, what are you going to do? Randomize parents saying, oh, your kid's going to be vegan, your kid's going to be omnivorous, and oh, you got twins, you're going to split them up. Like, you're just making all these jokes. But that's the reality of it. Like, that's what these people want, apparently, when they're asking for that. So what we do in epidemiology, I say we as if I'm an epidemiologist, what they do, what the researchers do, is they look at look at a population. They match them up very well. Typically, I mean, there are some studies that maybe aren't so good, but typically match them up very well on things like smoking status, socioeconomic status, educational income, all that. Um, Overall, like diet, some will even stratify by diet scores, like healthy eating index scores. They'll match them up on history of various diseases, family history of diseases. They'll even go so far for talking about like fracture studies, as we mentioned before. Have they given birth before? Have they not? They'll go through all of these different variables and try to match them up as well as possible. Those are the variables that when you do a randomized controlled trial, you're trying to match up. You're trying to just split them up randomly and hoping that everyone matches up really well. Whereas in epidemiology, you just do it after the fact. You follow people for a period of time, and then you match up all those variables before you do the statistical analysis. And so we need this in nutrition research. And even then, it's rare that I would take a single study and be like, oh, this proves causation. It proves that X causes Y. No, what I would normally do is I would look at these outcomes in the epi. I would also look to what kind of clinical trials do we have on these different foods and how they affect biomarkers. Okay, we know that red meat compared to plant protein increases LDL and ApoB. We know that those cause cardiovascular disease. And then we've got this epidemiology showing that red meat increases cardiovascular risk. We look at various populations. If you're seeing the same trend in various populations, great. If you look at similar dosing. So if you look at Asian countries and red meat consumption, you might not see a risk, but you're comparing very low intakes to also very low intakes, right? There's going to be a threshold to where you start to see risk. And so you have to look, okay, at what dose do we see risk? If it's very consistently at a serving a day or 3 servings a week or whatever it happens to be, then you can be pretty confident about those results. Right, that is ultimately what we're looking for. We're never using just one single study to really imply that this X causes Y. We're looking at the overall balance of evidence and coming to those conclusions in the end.
Tremendous. I think that covers it. And throughout
Okay.
throughout our conversation here and in the topics to follow, you have brought up epidemiological evidence. And I think for the listeners, that's a nice overview of why, yes, there are some limitations, but that doesn't mean it was a bad study, right? They can still be high quality. And furthermore, when there's a bunch of them across different populations showing the same effect, and then when we can look at controlled trials, which are showing some mechanisms that would explain the effects we're seeing there, like, this is all part of interpreting the science and understanding different levels of evidence, and putting these all together to come to more or less a coherent view of these topics. It can be real easy to get lost in the latest study and this headline, but ultimately it's just one pebble within this
Yeah.
within this ocean of research. And people like to forget about the study that was done 5 years ago and was higher quality and showed a completely opposite thing. Like, this is here now and this showed this. So
Yeah, and
let's
oftentimes those individuals who really rag on epidemiology, they'll cite it when it's in their favor,
right.
right? Like I see that, like Joe Rogan posting about I think the fracture risk in vegans or whatever. I actually commented on his post, asked if he was a postmenopausal underweight woman, because that's the population that they saw risk in. And it's just, it's so funny how that works.
Yeah, unfortunately, Joe Rogan's giving us within the evidence-based nutrition space a lot more work to do.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many people have come to me with questions. They're like, "Well, I heard it on Joe Rogan," and I'm like, "I don't know. Can you stop listening to it?"
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Catch his comedy special and then leave the rest, or whatever.
absolutely. Now let's move over to eggs. And perhaps before we get into the evidence of the relationship between eggs and cardiovascular disease, perhaps you could touch on the nutrient density of eggs and how that compares to other foods, because I think this is something that gets brought up first. And like, I guess it's similar to red meat, right? Like people will
Yeah.
just say how these animal based proteins are just so dense in a variety of vitamins and minerals. And for eggs in particular, they'll point to things like vitamin D, which based on, a recent NHANES analysis, it seemed like 95% of the US population isn't getting enough of, and maybe they'll point to choline. But is this justified when we consider the other nutrients that are in eggs, which might not be so beneficial
Mhm.
to health?
Yeah, so I mean, eggs, a quick rundown of just some of the key nutrients. I use the USDA, their food database, for this. One large egg has 6 grams of protein, 169 milligrams of choline, 300 international units of vitamin A, which is about 10% of daily requirements, 260 micrograms of lutein and zeaxanthin, which are carotenoids, important for eye health, or possibly beneficial for eye health. 50 international units of vitamin D. So that's only 8% of what's recommended in a day. 16 micrograms of selenium, which is about 30%. A mix of B vitamins, it's decent there. And then something they often get touted for is the omega-3 content, but it's like
Yeah.
220 milligrams. It's nothing. At the same time, it comes along with 1.6 grams of saturated fat, 200 milligrams of cholesterol. And if you choose free range, slightly better in some respects, slightly less saturated fat, slightly less cholesterol, but pretty much the same. Higher vitamin A, E content, and more, but still very low omega-3 content. And so I often, I see eggs touted as some nutrient powerhouse. And I've actually seen one individual who's very pro egg, I should say, cite the fact that, in a given population, they consume on average only 2 eggs a week. So it's not going to contribute to disease, but at the same time, eggs are an important source of nutrition. So which is it? Is it the fact you want to limit to 2 eggs a week, or do you think it's providing important nutrition? Because that 2 eggs a week, it isn't providing much at all. And so it's just it's a funny one that way too. But if we were to compare this to say equal amount of calories, tofu plus some nutritional yeast, which is how I typically make like an egg or a tofu scramble. It would blow it out of the water for protein. It would blow it out of the water for B vitamins, especially with the nutritional yeast. Definitely more minerals in the form of things like calcium and iron. It would have less choline. Soy is still a okay source of choline, but it would have less choline than the eggs. So eggs win there. But outside of that, I mean, it doesn't really seem to have much merit, especially when we talk about the benefits of soy on actual health outcomes. And then we look at eggs, which we'll do in a little bit here. So while eggs can provide nutrition, and maybe for people in certain circumstances where they don't have access to wider varieties of food, they need to rely on eggs for nutrition. I understand that, and they can be a very important source of nutrition for them. I'm not downplaying that. But if we're talking about choosing between eggs and something else for your nutrition, there are definitely going to be superior options. I actually did a video on eggs, and I compared equal amounts of eggs from an omelet versus a chickpea omelet. And again, the chickpea omelet ended up doing a lot better. I should have mentioned with tofu, you get some fiber as well. You get none in the eggs. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement with the nutrition there.
Great. Now let's get into some of the most recent evidence on the topic. I think that eggs might be, while one of the most controversial foods, it's also the one where I think most people are confused about, right? It's the meme with the guy sweating with 2 buttons, and it's like, never eat eggs ever, or should I eat half a carton a day? So like, wait, which one should it be? And you'll always hear these different things about cholesterol, right? And let's say like, oh, well, if you're ingesting, a decent amount of cholesterol, then endogenous production will compensate and reduce. And so you don't really have to worry about dietary cholesterol and how that might affect blood cholesterol. But with all of this noise, we do have some really good evidence on the topic, some dose response relationships. So why don't you discuss that for the
Yeah.
listeners?
Yeah. So on that note, yeah, we do have we have a meta-analysis going back to like the 90s now on metabolic ward experiments. So when people are basically they're locked in a room, I know they used to do these on like psych wards, so it's not very ethical, but you'd have complete control over everything that they're eating. And they'd measure changes in serum cholesterol levels when eating cholesterol. We also have a meta-regression, a more recent one by Vincent, and this one again looked at that relationship. They had a little bit better of the inclusion-exclusion criteria. It's a little bit more higher quality, but similar sort of relationship. And the relationship we see between eating dietary cholesterol and either LDL or total cholesterol is that it plateaus out. So it starts to go up. If you're going from zero cholesterol intake to some, it starts to shoot up. And then if you're already consuming a fair amount, it just kind of levels out. So if you're already eating a fair amount of animal products and you're eating, say, 300-400 milligrams of cholesterol a day, adding more is not going to do really much at all. So if you're taking an average American population, that can be the case a lot of the time. Now, if you take a bunch of vegans and you've started feeding them eggs, you'd see their LDL shoot right up. And that's something to keep in mind here. At the same time, we have another meta-analysis that was just published last year looking at specifically eggs. So not dietary cholesterol in isolation, but eggs as a whole, which do contain some saturated fat. They contain choline, which it may actually raise your LDL a bit as well, or ApoB as well. And so when you look at eggs and the relationship between that and LDL and ApoB, it's actually greater than you would see from dietary cholesterol alone. And it's not negligible. So we do see increases there that can be associated with risk. Now, when you get to the research on eggs and actual health outcomes, this is where it gets really muddy, because you'll have some studies looking at really poor contrast exposures. You'll be looking at studies that are comparing less than, like 2 a week to 5 a week or something like that. So it's, very small difference in intakes. You'll have a lot of studies that adjust for serum cholesterol or LDL cholesterol. So if eggs raise cardiovascular disease, at least in part by raising your LDL, but you make sure everybody you're comparing has equal LDL, well, you're just never going to see a risk there, right? You're removing that the function by which it actually increases risk, or at least one of the functions. So that a lot of studies do that, and that's considered an over adjustment. So when you look at studies that are actually very well designed to looking at a broad contrast of exposures, like one or less than one a week up to daily, essentially, you do see an increase in risk. And if we look at dose response relationships, we typically see that around even half an egg a day, you can see an increase in risk. And that is based on a couple studies, one from Zhuang, which was just earlier this year, one from Zhong, not to be confused with Zhuang, from a couple of years ago, 2019. Both of those found that half an egg increased risk. And the more recent one actually did a substitution analysis, as I mentioned before. And they looked at what happens when you substitute eggs for egg whites. And compared to egg whites, eggs increased risk. And that would actually be a really good way to tease out the effects of the egg yolk, the cholesterol and the choline and all of that that's in there, compared to the egg white, which people would ideally be using in a similar fashion, using in a similar way in their diets, just without all that extra baggage. And we do see an increase in risk there. So again, if you're having 2 a week, 3 a week or something, maybe not seeing a risk, but once you get up to about 4 a week is where we start to see that risk increase. And certainly very consistently, we seem to see a risk around 1 a day. So that would kind of be my summary of the data on that. And there's a really good review my friend of mine, Matt Medor, wrote up on My Nutrition Science. So you can always link that. People can check that out too. And it's the deep dive into all of this for people who want to learn about that.
Yeah, and that will definitely be linked up in the show notes with all of the other studies that we've been mentioning here throughout. But I thought that was great context. As I mentioned before going live, I do have a certain segment of the population that listens to this, quote unquote, evidence-based fitness. And there's just like an entirely different view on eggs and cholesterol. Like I've seen multiple times put forth that like dietary cholesterol is anabolic. And,
Oh my God, I've never heard
yeah.
that one.
Oh,
I've never
really?
heard that. I've never heard that.
Really?
No. Yeah.
Okay, that I might have to send you
Yeah,
a
that's a
thing
new
or
one.
two after. And then like someone within this space who they're like a PhD candidate, they've done some good work on refeeds, and they posted like a recent meta-analysis that came out, and it was just looking at the effect of egg consumption on flow mediated dilation, and based on these results, they were like, hey, eat your eggs, like it's completely fine. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, I think you're kind of missing the forest for the trees with this one. And as you touched on earlier, some of the issues with just looking at this outcome, right, flow mediated dilation, and how that could affect cardiovascular disease outcomes compared to a bunch of other evidence actually looking at these outcomes and seeing a negative effect.
Yeah, no, I've never heard that. That's a new one, so I'd like to see it. But as far as we have to not get caught up in these like very acute short-term responses. They're great for filling out our knowledge on a specific topic, but when we have outcome data looking at and seeing risk there, we can't just discount that because we found some sort of mechanism that may be beneficial in some way or another.
Yeah, for sure. Now, last one I want to get to here, Dr. Nagra, and that is dairy. And perhaps I can save a little bit of time with this one since we are coming up on time by just saying, hey, butter is associated with a bunch of negative health outcomes, like limit your butter consumption. I understand some people think it's tasty, but use it sparingly for those meals that you really want to indulge. But overall, stick to things like extra virgin olive oil, canola oil, as we discussed, cooking oils that have some good evidence behind them for decreasing the risk of cardiometabolic disease. But after that, there are some nuances to consider when it comes to milk and cheese and yogurt and the different fat content within these products. So I guess a nice overview to start with would be the fat content of dairy products, and if the fat content is of concern, should we be sticking to low non-fat products, or does it not really matter?
Yeah, so I think that the primary reason to limit certain dairy products is because of the fat content, because of its ability to raise obviously cardiovascular risk factors or markers, but then cardiovascular disease outcomes. And one really good study to look at this was actually it was a pooled analysis of 3 U.S. cohorts, and they compared the impact of dairy fat to vegetable fat to other animal fats, meaning meat in most cases, to various polyunsaturated fats, to carbohydrates from whole grains, and then to carbohydrates from refined starches. So this was a really good comparison. Again, similar sort of substitution type ideas as we mentioned before. You can tell I really like these. And they found that for cardiovascular disease, replacing 5%, actually it depends on which one we're looking at, but 5% of calories from dairy fat with vegetable fat reduced risk. So using vegetable based fats, which largely would be vegetable oils in most respects, especially if we're talking about US cohorts, or at least that would be my assumption, reduced risk. But if we compare it to meat fat, so equal amount of fat from meat products, it actually meat raised risk compared to dairy. So dairy's in the middle there, right? So that's just some nuance to keep in mind. If we compare it to polyunsaturated fats, whether we're talking about omega-6 fats, ALA, or even fish-based fats, the marine omega-3s, EPA and DHA, we again lower risk in all of those camps. If we replace the dairy fat with carbohydrates from whole grains, same deal, we lower risk. But if we replace dairy fat with carbohydrates from refined starch sources, we don't lower, it's actually neutral. So it really depends what you're comparing to. And when we look at health outcome data, so there's again a recent meta-analysis from I think it was 2020. I might be wrong by like a year, but looking at low-fat dairy and high-fat dairy products, and high-fat dairy products raised cardiovascular risk. Low-fat dairy products actually had a neutral impact. And now if you're replacing certain foods, there is data suggesting that low-fat dairy actually improves health outcomes. So usually if I'm counseling someone on diet and I wanted to really describe what the healthiest sort of dietary patterns are, I would describe them as dietary patterns rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, with or without fish and low-fat dairy. Those are, if you're going to consume animal products that you want to be able to consume without real limitation other than crowding out other healthy foods, those would be the ones, the low-fat dairy and the fish, in my opinion. Though I don't think that, I know there's some vegans that might take issue with that and try to downplay the benefits or play on the risks a bit, but really I don't see any reason to be limiting those two, other than for ethical, environmental considerations. But that would be like, as a really quick kind of overview, that would be what I would point to. And we do have some pretty great reviews and meta-analyses looking at different dairy sources and various outcomes. So like if we look at cancer outcomes, for example, we see increased risk of prostate cancer with certain dairy products, but decreased risk in colorectal cancer. And that's actually where the strongest evidence is, the lower colorectal cancer, which is likely driven by the calcium content. If we look at Alzheimer's, I believe it's a lower risk, and then a slightly increased risk of Parkinson's. So like you can get into the nitty gritty, but as a whole, if you're looking, taking a step back, just looking at dairy as a whole, specifically if you're looking at those lower fat sources, I don't see any real risk there. I think those are the best ones to go for, whether that be yogurt, low fat milks, and so on.
Perhaps a finer detail there. For my general understanding and what I've seen recently, it seems like low-fat Greek yogurt is consistently associated with some pretty positive health outcomes, at least relative to other low-fat dairy product. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know. I haven't looked enough to see if that varies from other types of yogurts, like if the Greek yogurt in particular. I'm not sure if there have been comparisons there, because I know yogurt in general is typically associated with good outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. I know everyone likes to debate over what's the best diet, and I don't know if we'll ever know, but as we've touched on here, there are definitely some pretty strong trends where we can be sure, like, hey, if the bulk of your diet consists of this, you're gonna do pretty well. I think based on the evidence, I'm fine with putting this out there because people get excited about like these what's the king of diets, like something very similar to a vegan diet with like a moderate dose of fatty fish and non-fat Greek yogurt. Like, I don't know, if we had like the perfect trial and we got to throw whatever diets we wanted into it, I think it might win. I don't know.
I don't know that we would see, if we were to compare a very healthy Mediterranean diet versus a very healthy vegan diet versus a very healthy sort of pescatarian diet you just described, I don't know that we'd really see much at all of a difference. If we did see a difference, we would need probably massive populations, which isn't going to be a randomized controlled trial for those who want it. We would need massive populations with like 25-year follow-up with, we would need just this incredible study to be done. I don't think we're ever going to really get that. I don't think we need to get that, to be honest. But it's going to be somewhere in that camp of just very heavy on the plants, minimal in the definitely processed foods, minimal in the animal products, but when including animal products, focused on those low-fat dairy sources like the Greek yogurt you mentioned, the fish, and so on. That's probably going to be the winner.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Dr. Nagra, we actually covered more or less everything we had in the outline. So thank you so much for your time. This has been a really awesome discussion. I enjoyed it a lot. For the listeners who want to go and learn more about you and support you, where can we point them towards?
Thanks. No, it's been a great chat. It's fun to kind of dive into this stuff. Sometimes it's a little more broad, but we got into some specifics here, so I like it. As far as following me, Instagram's where I'm most active. So if you're on there, it's just at Dr. Matthew Nagra, so dr.Matthew Nagra. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me there as well, at Dr. Matthew Nagra. I'm not as active right now. I'm actually super busy helping out with our COVID-19 immunization practices out here. So working tons of hours there. So, once that's done, I'll probably be more active there. And then I have a website, drmatthewnagra.com, where I mostly just link up like this podcast I'll put on there and any kind of podcast appearances. Occasionally some just short blog articles, but they aren't super deep dives. I save that for more other platforms. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to message me on any of those social media platforms. I'm typically pretty good at getting back to you. So, hope you enjoyed the episode and learned something from it.
I will link up those resources in the show notes. But everyone, that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.